Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, for being so prompt right at the hour. We'll still be letting in a few more people, but we do have a very full agenda tonight, so I think we will get started. Yeah, so great to see so many familiar names coming into the meeting. Many of you have been with us for several years now, so it's going to be very exciting to talk with you tonight. I want to start, my name's Jennifer Bing, and I work at the American Friends Service Committee, and I work with my colleagues here at Defense for Children International Palestine, and all of us were glued to our news stations this afternoon, listening to the verdict in the Chauvin trial, and we felt that it was really important to start out our webinar tonight with thinking about that. In particular, Keith Ellison, who is the Minnesota Attorney General, spoke about the verdict. He said, "I would not call today's verdict justice, because justice implies true restoration, but it is accountability, which is the first step towards justice." And that quote from Keith Ellison, who was actually a representative in Congress when we started the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, and was actually present at our very first congressional briefing, was somebody that we looked to for launching our campaign, which is also about accountability and trying to build new systems that will bring justice. So it seems appropriate that all of you are joining us this evening to talk about our campaign and this new legislation. So we're really excited that you joined us. For tonight's webinar, we are going to do a little bit of background about how did we get to this point. There may be some new people on the call tonight. Although we see a lot of familiar faces, there are some new ones. So we wanted to do a little, just take a breath and see how we got here. We also are going to share some updates on the ground. As you know, Shana does that so well, of giving us an overview about what are the conditions for children in Palestine. And then we are going to get into the exciting news of today's webinars, the new bill in Congress, HR 2590, which we're calling, the shorthand version is the Palestinian Children and Families Act. We'll be giving you the full title and talking through the contents of the bill with you tonight. And I know many of you are joining us tonight so that you can get into the weeds with us a little bit about what is in the bill. So we'll be doing that tonight, sharing with you some resources. Thanks to my colleague Miranda and Shana for getting so much up on our website. We'll be taking you to those places so you can easily find them as you begin your advocacy. And we do want to stay on maybe a little extra over the hour to answer some of your questions. And also let you know that we will be doing another kind of office hours in 2 weeks from now. So if you have more questions and you want to talk to us, not over email, but on the Zoom platform, we're going to give you that opportunity too. So let's get started. As I mentioned, I'm Jennifer Bing, and I'm joined by Shana and Miranda and Brad, and the four of us will be presenting all these different parts of the call tonight. So I'll start off a little bit with some history. Oh, here's our history. So the campaign began in 2015 as a joint effort between American Friends Service Committee and Defense for Children International Palestine. And that picture at the top is actually our very first congressional briefing that Keith Ellison actually spoke to. And in those first years of our campaign, we focused a lot on Dear Colleague letters, which was a way of bringing the issue of Palestinian children's rights and the issue of children in detention specifically to the attention of members of Congress. So we produced a film, Detaining Dreams. Many of you on this call may have seen that 20-minute video. It's still available on our website, as well as some other videos that we've made since then. And we kind of had as our organizing strategy, having vehicles in Congress to be able to engage with elected officials. And that was mainly around these Dear Colleague letters and briefings that we organized together with partners across the country. In the next slide, you'll see that we moved from having Dear Colleague letters to actual bills in Congress. And that started in 2017, at the end of 2017, when Representative Betty McCollum, who had really been and continues to be a champion on this issue, introduced a bill, HR 4391, which was the first bill in US history to address Palestinian human rights. So that was a great breakthrough. And in the two Congresses up till today, we also had another bill, HR 2407, which again focused on promoting the rights of Palestinian children and looking at ways that we could hold our US aid to Israel accountable to not include support for human rights abuses, which leads us to this year's bill, HR 2590, and we still haven't figured out a clever way of remembering that number, but HR 2590 is the new bill that we're going to talk about tonight. And as you will see, the bill expanded a bit from not just focusing on Palestinian children in detention, but also their families, and particularly the demolition of Palestinian homes and structures and continued land annexation. So there's language, as you'll hear tonight, about those issues as well. So the next slide shows that, all through this process of building support for bills and advocacies has really depended on people like all of you joining the call tonight, and many, many others, of learning how, for many of us, it was a new thing to engage members of Congress, mainly because it wasn't actually, we didn't have good vehicles to engage them. We could just protest. Usually we're protesting bad legislation and not supporting good ones. And also learning about the issue. I was meeting with some of my Chicago colleagues earlier today, and we were reminiscing about sitting around the table and reading UNICEF reports and DCI reports and trying to learn the legalistic language. And that's also been part of this campaign, is to get into the weeds and understand the laws and the human rights reports, and be able to talk to our friends and family and neighbors and in our churches and synagogues and mosques about this issue. So that's a little bit about where we've come, and I will turn it over now to Shana to give some updates from on the ground.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So those of you that tune in regularly know that typically we begin our updates from the ground by talking about the conditions of Palestinian child detainees. But tonight I thought that we would do something a little bit different. First of all, as for those of you that have been tuning in for the last 6 or 7 months or so, we've stopped receiving the number of children updates from the Israel Prison Service about the number of children in detention. So rather than show you all the same slide for the 6th or 7th time with the September figures, I wanted to get into some of the other work that we at DCIP have been focusing on, and really start to think about how some of this additional documentation that we've been doing connects to the legislation that Brad is going to talk about, and Miranda will describe some of the resources. So the first thing, as Jennifer alluded to, is that this new legislation broadens beyond just the child detention focus and looks specifically at around the issues of home demolitions, forcible transfer, and Israeli annexation of West Bank land. So I think within the last couple of weeks, we published a feature on the DCI website, and hopefully Miranda will find the link and drop it in the chat for those of you that want to read up about this. And we'll also make sure to share it in our follow-up email about a community in the northern Jordan Valley called Humsat al-Bakia, also known as Khirbat Humsa al-Fuka, which has been, both names have been used in coverage of this community. And the community has been demolished 6 times since November of last year, 5 times in this year alone, between January and the beginning of March. And that included 165 structures that were destroyed. Not all of them were residential structures. Some of them were for keeping farm animals. Some of them were structures that are used for water and sanitation and hygiene purposes, like portable toilets and things like that. And 94 of those 165 structures were donor funded, meaning that countries and blocks like the EU had donated those buildings for those communities, most likely because their pre-existing structures had already been demolished. As I put in the slide, the most recent demolition was on February 22nd, 2021, and these demolitions, they're important for a number of reasons. The first thing is just on a moral and human level, to think about communities and families that are losing their homes over and over and over again. You know, here in the United States, we often see on the evening news those devastating images of homes that have been destroyed by natural disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods. In this case, these are people who are going through that trauma of losing their home, but rather than it being, you know, an act of God or a natural occurrence, it's coming from the occupying power, which is under international humanitarian law meant to protect the occupied population. The reason that these demolitions are happening, and they're happening largely in strategic areas, is because they're areas that are either like the Jordan Valley, strategic, either because the Jordan Valley is on the eastern side of the West Bank. And so by removing a Palestinian population and increasing an Israeli presence there, it's isolating Palestinians from and preventing them from accessing that border with Jordan. And it's also the Jordan Valley is one of the most fertile parts of Palestine and really is the breadbasket of Palestine. So it's also there are lots of, while there aren't many settlers living in that area, there are lots of settlements that are agricultural, where, you know, dates and other fruits are grown. And so part of the strategy is really to take over as much Palestinian land as possible and force Palestinians into smaller and smaller urban environments. The second place that we're seeing a lot of demolitions and evictions is in occupied East Jerusalem. And there's been a lot of focus recently, as many of you likely know, on the communities in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. And as of now, hundreds of people are slated to be evicted from their homes. I believe the first wave of evictions is set to happen on May 2nd, right in the middle of Ramadan and on Orthodox Easter. And again, this is a strategic decision by Israel to, one, fragment the Palestinian population, and to force Palestinians out of Jerusalem in this case. This is all part of the Israeli plan to continue to annex and take over more and more Palestinian land, again, pushing Palestinians into smaller and smaller enclaves within the West Bank, or even creating conditions that are so horrible that Palestinians will leave their land. Also, and before I move on to the next issue, I just want to flag that there's a really great resource on the OCHA website. OCHA is the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It's a UN office or agency, and they have a great website with a lot of resources, and they have a really awesome database of home demolitions and demolitions and confiscation of structures and displacement in the West Bank. And so you can find that by going to their website and looking under where it says data, and there's a West Bank demolition and displacement section, and on that link there's a place where you can find kind of another link to this chart, and really you can look and see. For example, you can search for Humsat al-Bakia and see exactly what happened, how many people were displaced, the exact dates. It's a fantastic resource. So I just want to flag that. And for those of you who are already starting to think about meeting with your elected officials, talking to your communities about HR 2590, this is a great resource to kind of get the most up-to-date facts about demolitions and displacement. Tied into this idea of displacement is an increase in settler violence that we've seen, and this is all intended to really make sure that Palestinians are frightened, that they don't have access, that they stay within enclosed spaces and aren't accessing, for example, their agricultural land, driving between cities, and really there's an element of impunity that's ongoing throughout the West Bank, where settlers are either attacking Palestinians, Israeli settlers are attacking Palestinians, either without being stopped by Israeli forces, who again are under the laws of occupation meant to be protecting the Palestinian population, but also sometimes in coordination or with the tacit approval of Israeli forces. And so we've documented at DCI a sharp increase just in the beginning of the year. In a 4-week or so period between January 17th and February 15th, we documented 4 attacks against children that resulted in 6 children aged 6 to 13 being injured. 2 of those children required trips to the hospital for stitches and treatment. And this photo on the right is a little girl, Hala, who was 10, who was struck in the face with a stone, lost consciousness. Her mother and younger brother had to help carry her inside the home, and their home continued to be attacked by settlers who were throwing stones for about 10 minutes until they finally left, and the family was able to get Hala in a private car and get her treatment at the hospital. Again, this is extremely traumatizing for children, not only the children who are injured, but also their siblings, their families. And the idea here is that, Palestinians are made to be fearful and are less likely to want to stay in areas where they're vulnerable. Most of these settler attacks, have taken place in close proximity, unsurprisingly, to illegal Israeli settlements. And so again, they're purposely targeting these communities because they want to expand their settlements. They want to continue to grow, and targeting families, targeting children is a very strong way to send a message that Palestinians should leave. If a Palestinian parent wants their child to be safe, they're saying, if you want your kid to be safe, then leave. That's the purpose of this. So, and I see Miranda, thank you, has dropped the link in around to our report around settler violence. It's happening across the West Bank, north, south, east, and west. Anywhere you can really find a settlement, you'll hear about settler violence. So I encourage you all to check out those resources and make sure that now, particularly because HR 2590 is broadening beyond just the child detention work that we've focused on in previous legislation, that these are some topics that we want to make sure that you're feeling confident in your ability to communicate about and talk to your elected officials about. So I think I will leave it there. Oops. And pass it back to Jennifer to give a little bit of an introduction to this new piece of legislation that we've been previewing already. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. Yes, so as Shana said, we are going to talk in a minute about some of the differences between the previous bill 2407 and the new one. But just to say, one of the exciting headlines, besides the fact that it's a strong bill and has all these components, really has been the amazing amount of support, organizational support and endorsements that came in a few days last week. I know all the people, many people on this call were working late hours, calling and emailing and contacting various organizations to ask if they would co-sponsor. Our initial excitement was that there were 30 number of organizations, and now we're actually just topping over 100. So that's really, I think, a testament to the growth of the Palestinian solidarity movement and the way that Palestine has really arrived at the progressive agenda, because many of the organizational endorsements are from organizations that for the first time that they are putting their name to a Palestine-related bill. You see in the picture the first 13 that came on as co-sponsors, with Betty McCollum leading this bill as she has previous ones. Couple of days after the bill was released, 2 additional members of Congress have co-sponsored. So we're at 15 at this point. And with all the organizational endorsements and all the good work that we know is going to take place, including all of you, we hope that the co-sponsors of this bill will exceed previous bills that we've been a part of. So I'll turn it over now to Brad for the moment we've all been waiting for, which is to get into the content of the bill. It's a long one, so sit back and Brad will march us through all the sections, but thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And again, thanks to everybody that's sort of already supporting the bill through the local organizations and sort of groups that have signed on that might be represented here. I also just want to flag that we're still taking organizational endorsements and group endorsements. So you'll find a link on the endorsing organizations page that we have on the No Way to Treat a Child website for a Google form where you can sign up your group to endorse the organization, and we'll keep adding to that list as a way to show the sort of grassroots support, institutional support, right, across the country. So I encourage everybody to do that if you are part of a group that hasn't endorsed it already. So what I'm going to try to do is really just like walk through the bill, the different sections, explain the substance and some of the differences between this bill and the previous bill, and maybe the bill before that even, because there's some similarities, there's some differences, and I think it's important that folks kind of understand what the bill says, what's in there, and then most importantly, how we can use it. Because I think the thing to say off the top is that this bill is not going to become law, right? This bill is a vehicle that we can use to facilitate conversations, facilitate engagement with policymakers, institutions, organizations, right? Sort of that's the utility of it, kind of broadly. It gives a vehicle, it's a long-term organizing vehicle. We'll have it through the end of this Congress, so through the end of 2022, that we can lift it up, use it, and essentially say, do you support it or not? And use it as that vehicle to really kind of push the discourse forward and have people stand up and sort of affirmatively support Palestinian rights. So that's the preamble. So as we get into the bill, we know that it's HR 2590. It's again has a Section 1 short title that's a lie. It's not. It's a long title. It's the Defending the Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation Act. We've never managed to have a nice, concise title. We again failed with this one. I think the title here, I think that it does reflect the pieces that are important to Representative McCollum, and what is central to her commitment to this particular issue area and for leading on these particular vehicles. It's very much about children, families, and specifically sort of the families and children living under Israeli military occupation. So we had a couple different kind of suggestions, ideas, and this is where we landed. So we know it's a mouthful, but Palestinian Children and Families Act, as the sort of colloquial grassroots shorthand, is also an option. But just a flag, right? It is a mouthful. I feel like I just got used to the 24/7 title, and now we've got another mouthful. So what comes next is essentially the kind of the justification for the bill, right? You could kind of say the finding section, which is Section 2, lays out the factual issues underlying the need for taking action. So the way that the finding sections are drafted, they sort of set out overarching factual information. So you see on your screen here, and for folks joining on the phone, the paragraph 1 is just flagging the about 3 million Palestinians live in the West Bank, of which around 45% are children under the age of 18 who have lived their entire lives under Israeli military control. Right, very straightforward, sort of matter of fact, factual paragraphs that build a narrative in themselves for why the later sections would sort of be important. I'm gonna stay on the finding section just for a minute, Shayna, if you want to move back the slide. Just to flag what's in the finding section, right? The bill focuses on sort of 3 specific issue areas, where previous bills we've been very narrow in focusing specifically on Israeli military detention of Palestinian children from the occupied West Bank. Here, sort of the issue area has expanded. We still carry through that same sort of prohibition around Israeli military detention of Palestinian children, but it includes home demolitions, destruction of property, as well as annexation, which, when you think about what Israeli military occupation means and what the impact is, and what we see as the motivations and sort of intentions of controlling the Palestinian population, it ultimately comes down to taking away land and moving Israeli citizens into occupied territory. So the trajectory from the very narrow to the very broad from military detention of children to annexation, the findings essentially kind of attempt to provide the factual narrative that leads to those conclusions to justify the bill. So in the findings section, you will find specific detail, specific documentation, specific reference to all of the different types of ill treatment that Palestinian children face in the Israeli military detention system. You'll find specific legal conclusions and legal statements on the legality of the destruction of property in occupied territory under international law, specific information on home demolitions, destruction of property, and then right through to annexation as a violation of international law. And the other piece that we included sort of at the tail end of the findings is a specific sort of just listing of US funding to Israel and the different pockets of that funding that go toward, that are provided to Israel and sort of what it is. Because I think this is one thing that through the different vehicles, through the different bills that we've had, right, yes, it's about the end goal and what the operational provisions are, but it's also a tool to educate members of Congress, to educate staff, to point things out that might not otherwise have that detail. So breaking down the specific package of funding in the findings, we hope helps bring this to kind of like what the actual funding from the US to Israel, just to bring a little bit more awareness to what it actually is. And I'll come back to that once we get to a later section. But those are the findings, essentially. So the way to think about the findings and the utility of sort of a robust findings section is that these are, right, talking points. These are kind of your top line messaging that you can use if you're doing a meeting with a staff member or the local office of a member of Congress. If you're talking to their foreign policy staffer, right, these should sort of guide you and they give you a resource to pull from. And then we'll have more resources beyond this, but this is sort of your universe on the top line messaging. So moving through the bill, a sense of Congress section is what comes next. So the sense of Congress, right, these are really, so the findings, the sense of Congress, and the next section that follows, the statement of policy, these are essentially non-binding. They don't really ever, they don't do anything, they don't have any impact, but they're a space where you can kind of put out a proactive message, a specific intention sort of behind the later sections that are binding and operational. So here we've sort of included both a sense of Congress section and a statement of policy. So the sense of Congress section essentially says, right, it's the sense of Congress that actions by the government of Israel in the occupied West Bank, including the detention and prosecution of Palestinian children, the seizure, appropriation, and destruction of Palestinian property, and forcible transfer of civilians, and further annexation of Palestinian land, right, are contrary to the values of the American people, undermine efforts by the United States to achieve just and lasting peace, and then there's, promoting human rights, human dignity, democratic rights for all Israelis and Palestinians, foreign policy priorities, right? It sort of lists out the aspirational sort of intentions behind the legislation, behind the specific violations that are included, and gives a sort of sense of why somebody that might co-sponsor this, why somebody that might vote to enact this into law would be doing so. So we like to include those sections to have that explicit sort of affirmation of that rights-based focus within that section. Similarly, in the statement of policy, this is a little bit more concise than a sense of Congress, much more sort of tailored to the specific operational pieces of the bill. So here, essentially, this is the entire statement of policy. It is the policy of the United States not to support actions by the government of Israel involving military detention of Palestinian children in violation of international law, seizure, appropriation, destruction of Palestinian property or forcible transfer, further annexation. And those are the three pieces of the bill that sort of come next. So the utility of this is then, right, you thinking about you're a member of Congress. These are the things that you're essentially saying, like, do you think the US should support the military detention of Palestinian children? Yes or no, right? This is your checklist. This lists out what this bill is trying to ensure US support and funding to Israel is prohibited from supporting, right? And this allows you to sort of script it out and go forward with it. Next is Section 5. So this is the would-be binding section. This is the meat of the bill. This is what the whole bill is about. So Section 5 is a limitation on assistance. It's structured as a prohibition. So essentially what it says is that none of the funds provided or authorized to be appropriated to Israel in the form of military funding can go to any of the following prohibited purposes. So the first is the same sort of language that we've used in 2407 and 4391 around the military detention, interrogation, abuse, and ill treatment of Palestinian children. And then we have sort of a subset of specific practices that are identified, from torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, just generally physical violence, including stress positions, hooding, sensory deprivation, incommunicado detention or solitary confinement, administrative detention, arbitrary detention, as well as denial of access to parents or legal counsel during interrogations, which many of these are the norm based on the documentation from DCI Palestine and other organizations. As we know, ill treatment is widespread, systematic in the Israeli military detention system. So that's the first sort of piece. And that's similar to, as I said, 4391, that's similar to 2407. The next section, or the next subsection, is where we start to broaden out. So Section 5, subsection 2, specifically focuses on the seizure, appropriation, or destruction of Palestinian property, and then the correlated sort of impact of forcible transfer of civilians in the occupied West Bank. So no US assistance funding can go to supporting those practices. And then the third subsection is no US funds can go towards deploying or supporting the deployment of personnel, training, services, lethal materials, equipment, facilities, logistics, transportation, or other activity to territory in the occupied West Bank that essentially furthers or aids and abets, supports the annexation of Palestinian land. And those are, right, that's the substance. Those are the three things that would be prohibited under this law if it were enacted. And then the way that this works, right? So you have these prohibitions, you have these limitations on assistance, sure, great. How do you measure them? How do you know what's happening? How do you know if funds are flowing someplace that they shouldn't be? So the operational sort of component of how these are tracked is through a certification process. So subsection B, certification, right? You have a prohibition, and then the certification would require the Secretary of State to submit reports annually to both the House and Senate Committees on Appropriations and Foreign Affairs, essentially saying that, either certifying that none of the funds provided to Israel in the previous fiscal year were used for any of the prohibited practices. And if he couldn't certify that, then he'd have to certify that the funds were used and describe how they were used to support the prohibited practices listed in the bill. So that's something that's very similar to what we had in HR 4391 back in the 115th Congress. right? It's really this prohibition and certification paradigm. Essentially, certification and reporting is the enforcement mechanism. It's not a bill that would sort of withhold aid or cut aid, right? It really is about transparency and having specific certifications around where funding is going. And the long-term sort of view of that would be, right, once we have more detail, have more transparency where there's very little transparency on where US funding is actually going and what it's supporting, and having that international law analysis of what's sort of right, what's acceptable and what violates international law, then we get into other sort of vehicles and other mechanisms that can be kind of more appropriate. So again, that certification reporting is very similar to the 4391 bill and approach we use there. The last couple sections here, just to touch on them briefly. So section 6, oversight and additional reporting. This gets right to that documentation, transparency. What is the human impact of occupation? What do US funds sort of directly support, indirectly support? This is meant to really create a record of the human rights violations that Israeli forces perpetrate against Palestinian children and families, and sort of follows the same 3 issue areas that we've flagged in the previous sections of the bill. Section 7 is a little bit wonky, in the weeds, and it's, I think, potentially the most unprecedented piece of the bill, because it hones in on the specific piece of funding that Israel gets to use to spend down on Israeli weapons industry. So the majorities of, so Israel receives $3.8 billion a year. Most people probably know that figure. The bill was introduced on tax day, so there's sort of a number of actions on April 15th throughout the US where folks are sort of flagging their US tax dollars that go to Israel and the harm that they cause. This bill, as I said in the findings, lists out the specific pockets of money that's provided to Israel each year. And one piece of that, right, around $800 million is money that Israel gets to spend specifically on its own weapons industry. The large, pretty much all of the other funds, right, end up getting spent on US weapons contractors. But this 800 million is unique because the Israeli military can essentially just buy whatever they want from whoever they want within Israel. So there's the old 1991 report where members of Congress were concerned and really wanted to look at the offshore procurement, is what this called, funds that Israel used. And there was a report drafted by the General Accountability Office, which is essentially the legislative branch's auditor, right? They can sort of task them to look at executive branch activities, to see if they're in compliance with the legislative mandates, and then to see if their processes with, the funds that Congress has authorized to be spent by the executive, they've sort of followed the rules and followed what they should do, and have the receipts. So we took that 1991 report and essentially said, we want that now. Let's look at the specific offshore procurement funds. Are they spent appropriately, right? Are they tracked, and is the executive branch sort of in compliance with legislative directives and mandates for how they should be spent? So that's this last section. Again, it's a little bit more in the weeds for most folks, but it gets us into that discussion around transparency and accountability for US funding to Israel in a more concrete way than we've been able to before. Because when it comes to this specific sort of pocket of money, there's very little transparency, there's very little accountability, there's very little tracking or monitoring of where Israel spends that funds. So if it's a US sourced weapon, right, that is involved in the murder and killing of a Palestinian child at a protest, right, that should be concerning because it's a US sourced weapon. There's a number of existing laws that would sort of be flagged in that case. The other piece, right, is that even if it's not a US sourced weapon, we should be concerned as the American government, as Americans, as taxpayers, because of this 800 million that allows Israel to spend on their own weapons industry, right? So that means that even if it's an Israeli made weapon with Israeli ammunition, it still could be US funds that purchased that equipment that led to that unlawful killing or other violation. So it's significant in the grand scheme of what we're pushing for on accountability for that particular piece. So I'll pause there. That's the end of the bill. We've made it to section 7, and I'll turn it here to Miranda to talk about how we can use it.
Thanks, Brad. We had some questions come through the chat. I wanted to let everybody know we should have some time for questions at the end. We might run a little bit over, but we'll hang on to answer some questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat now, and we'll go through them at the end of the webinar. Shayna, would you like to unshare your screen so I can share mine? All right. All right, can you see my screen? Okay. All right, I wanted to let everybody know that we have a new section of the No Way to Treat a Child website, specifically dedicated to resources about the new bill. This is a brand new section we just added on Friday, so there are only a few things in it right now, but I wanted to show you what's there, just in case you didn't happen to memorize every word Brad just said. We have some shorter resources here to help you refer back to as you think through this bill and how you'd like to advocate for it. So to get to this page, you're going to go to the top of the screen in the Updates and Resources section and click on HR 2590, and that'll bring you to this page right here. So we've got a number of sort of explainer resources that I hope will be useful to you. The first one I wanted to point out is this right here. This is a legislation overview we wrote that is sort of a 2-page summary of what Brad just talked about. It focuses on the prohibition of funds and the accountability mechanisms built into the bill. So this is about 1 page that'll explain that to you. If you'd like to hear the 45-second version of the bill, there's a video that you can watch that's in this page right here. Up here we have a resource that Shayna put together that has a number of statistics and talking points focused on Palestinian children in Israeli military detention. This is actually a printable PDF, so if you'd like to print it out, hold on to it, mark it up, practice your talking points, this is a great resource for that. We are planning on adding a similar resource to focus on home demolitions and annexation, which are the other 2 major topics covered in the bill, so you can have some more information about that. These 2 resources right here are about the different folks who have endorsed the bill. So first we have the representatives who have co-sponsored the bill, and then we have the endorsing organizations. So first you have the co-sponsors. These are all the representatives in Congress who have signed on to the bill. We'll be updating this regularly as more co-sponsors come in. So you can think of this as a resource to help you keep track of who has signed on. Hopefully some of you see your representatives here. This information is also available on congress.gov, which tracks different information related to different bills. Over here, we have the list of endorsing organizations, which, as Jennifer noted, we now have more than 100, which is amazing. This list was last updated on Friday, so you won't see every single one of them represented just yet. But if you're listening to this and represent an organization that would like to endorse HR 2590, you can go to this page and fill out this Google form. And in a few days, we'll add you to this list. You can see it's a big, long list in alphabetical order, but it's really exciting to see all these different organizations of all sizes. We have some very small local grassroots groups, as well as some like much larger groups, which is really exciting to see. The last resource I wanted to draw your attention to that we have right now is a tool to contact your lawmaker about the bill. So this tool, you can actually put in your address and it will detect who your representative is and let you know if they have co-sponsored the bill or not, and provide the right message to send to them, whether it's thank you so much for co-sponsoring the bill, or hey, I see you haven't signed on to this yet, please consider. So those are all the resources we have on the website right now relating to the bill. We are planning on adding more in the coming weeks. So if you have questions, if you if you know that there are resources that will be useful to you when thinking about talking with your elected officials, please let us know. And we will be happy to add those to the website so you and others can look to those and refer to those. Shana, I think we're back to
Great. Thank you so much, Miranda. And let me reshare my screen for all of you. Here we go. All right. And I just dropped a link into the chat with the congress.gov site, and you can register. And Jennifer's also put the list down here where you can find the link where you can find co-sponsors. And one of the things that I love about congress.gov is that you can actually register for an account and set an alert so that anytime there's a change made to the bill, you'll be notified about it. So I was thrilled when I woke up Saturday morning and had a notification that there was a change to the bill, and it was a change in co-sponsors, and that we'd gotten 2 new co-sponsors added to the bill. So that's a really good way to stay on top of things, get those updates. You'll be the first to know. And so I just wanted to add a couple of things. One, you should feel free to reach out to our team, Jennifer, Brad, Miranda, me, if you need any advocacy support, strategizing about how to set up a meeting or what you should have on your agenda for a meeting, things like that. So you can reach out to us either at our personal email addresses, or to probably the best way to reach all 4 of us is if you just email the No Way email address, info@nowaytotreatachild.org. As I mentioned, there's the great congress.gov site, which is updated pretty quickly, aside from the fact that they still haven't posted the full text of the bill, but they are quick in terms of getting the co-sponsors and things like that. And then the final thing is, we alluded to earlier in the meeting that we're planning to have a drop-in on May 4th from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern. for folks who have any additional questions, any questions that might come up within the next 2 weeks. And really, we know that we talk at you a lot in these webinars, but we really want to make sure that we take time to answer people's individual questions and help kind of triage the needs of you, our fantastic and loyal supporters. So you can come for a bit or come for just a portion of that hour, but we wanted to really give you all the space to get your questions answered and be able to engage with us in a more intimate type of setting. So make sure to mark that on your calendars, and we'll have another webinar talking more about broader issues and similar format to our typical webinars a couple of weeks later. So I think I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can move on to some of the questions that people have. Maybe I'll throw one out that I saw, and then in the chat that maybe Brad, you can talk a little bit about. Someone asked about the significance of J Street endorsing this bill, and if we think that'll. I guess my question is to build off of that one is like, what's the significance of that, and what are the opportunities that might come out of kind of broadening the scope of our supporters on this legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, J Street support is significant, given, we've had multiple bills in Congress previously that have gone without support from J Street and, a range of other organizations as well. It's a moment to sort of think and celebrate and figure out how to move forward. But I think what it marks is the issues that we started out in 2015 and planning in 2014, sort of with, people sort of laughing at us and thinking about going to Congress on these issues, and that it would be futile, right? Like, I think it shows that, like, if you bring a narrow issue, you build through the grassroots, and you sort of focus on congressional advocacy, not for, where necessarily you think the policy should be, but focus on building a grassroots movement and facilitating that and sort of exploiting congressional advocacy to do the political work that's necessary to get you there, right? So your end goal, I think that's like proving to be like a success. So I think, like, the more that we have supporting organizations, whether it's J Street or others, and right, they're coming to us because of the thing that we're building, that's really how we're shifting power and how we're shifting the discourse on these issues, and essentially creating more and more kind of political support to change the policies that have been so disastrous for Palestinian people, right? So the significance is huge. I think we haven't changed anything yet, though, right? Like, I think that's the the thing that, and even if this bill was law, it doesn't go far enough, right? It sort of would still allow Israeli forces to continue doing all the terrible things that are happening to Palestinian children and families. US money just wouldn't be involved, essentially, right? So there's a lot more to do, and there's a lot farther to go, and we need to keep pushing. And I think it's great that there's so many endorsing organizations and so many new endorsing organizations, so many cross movement sort of organizations that are coming to a Palestinian issue focus campaign, for the first time, maybe publicly. But it's still, like, we have a lot to do and a lot to build on. So I don't know. I'm a very cynical person, it feels like, most of the time, despite my cheery demeanor. But I think it is significant. It does show that, like, this has been a useful and worthwhile endeavor over the years, from when we started it with not really knowing kind of where we would end up. But that baseline is growing in Congress, it's growing nationwide, and I think the number of endorsing organizations, J Street and beyond, is hugely sort of representative of that shift that we've been able to drive with other partners, with other organizations and groups, and sort of the range of grassroots folks moving this issue locally.
Thanks, Brad. We have a few other questions. Folks, I realize we're at the top of the hour, so if you have to head off, thank you for joining. I think we can stay a few more minutes to answer some of the really good questions that have come in. Brad, could you speak a little bit about how Gaza fits in or doesn't with this bill? We've had a few folks ask about Gaza.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that this bill doesn't touch. I think the quick explanation is that while we've been able to broaden from a very sort of child detention West Bank focus, we haven't been able to broaden all the way to the entire sort of full scale of Israeli violations to be encompassed in a vehicle like this. You don't have child detention in Gaza. You don't have home demolition, seizure of property, kind of in the same way that's characterized as this bill in Gaza. You don't have annexation in Gaza, right? So there's sort of a limit, and this is where, as I said just a minute ago, like the bill doesn't go far enough. It should, we would want a bill that sort of provided that full scale, critical sort of approach to all violations against Palestinian rights, not just children. And we're just not there, right? I think that's where it really is, like, we have to do the work to build that movement and shift the discourse so that we do have a vehicle that's focused, on Gaza, or brings in violations in Gaza, closure of Gaza, and sort of the policies that are perpetuated there that just destroy Palestinian lives. So, I hope that we in this Congress can at least kind of put together a vehicle that addresses specific violations in Gaza. This bill doesn't, but that sort of doesn't mean that we can't talk about Gaza, we can't talk about closure, we can't talk about the issues that people and Palestinians living in Gaza face. I think that's something that we've learned with the previous bills, is that just having the vehicle, right, creates a space where we can bring all of these issues to members of Congress, to our communities, to our churches, right? And that's really like the utility of it. So even though this bill doesn't specifically kind of encapsulate issues that Palestinians in Gaza face, it's not off the table, right? We should be raising it, and and we did this previously with the prior bills during the Great March of Return, when children were being shot by Israeli snipers from across the perimeter fence in Gaza, right? We had members of Congress sign on to the child detention bill because of what was happening along the perimeter fence and the unlawful killing that was happening. So these are, right, vehicles that facilitate that engagement, facilitate that awareness raising. So it's not, because it's not included, doesn't mean that we can't talk about it, we can't bring it to members of Congress. So I encourage everybody to, right, if they have questions on how to talk about an issue that they don't see in the bill, just come to us. Like, we do it all the time. It's how we sort of work, and it's useful, right? That's the point.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks, Jennifer, for hopping into the chat to answer a few other questions. Brad, we had a few folks ask about how the conditions and enforcement mechanisms in 2590 meshed with the Leahy Law. As we know, HR 2407 in the previous Congress had an amendment to the Leahy Law included, and this bill does not. Can you speak a little bit about how sort of these enforcement mechanisms work together or not?
So, I mean, with this bill, that's not going to become law. That's not right. It doesn't work, right? It's not. There's no enforcement. if we had the certification reporting, sort of hypothetically, it's not necessarily strong teeth to really change behavior. Money's fungible in the end, so it is pretty limited. But with existing laws, right, we've also seen and know over the years that existing laws aren't implemented fully against Israel for violations that fall specifically in those mandates of existing laws. So part of what we're trying to change is the political will just to recognize Palestinian humanity and Palestinian or violations against Palestinians that are inherent in occupation. Because it really is like, whether there's Leahy Law, there's an exception for Israel. Laws like HR 2590 that are draft bills, right, introduced, they're not binding, like they're just as effective as the Leahy Law when it comes to Israel. So I think there is some component of existing laws, Leahy laws that, right, should be enforced. I think if you looked at them objectively, and they're just not, right, due to the political deference that the executive branch will bring, and then the bipartisan support overwhelmingly that the Congress brings to these issues. So what we've found over the years is that impunity is essentially created by lack of transparency, lack of monitoring, lack of like actually understanding where US funds go, lack of understanding around what the actual end use monitoring of US weapons to Israel sort of entails, right? Members of Congress don't know that, the State Department doesn't know that. So that's where we focus kind of specifically on the transparency piece. And just for folks that I realize I'm talking about the Leahy Law, but people probably don't know what that might mean. So the Leahy Law is an existing US law that's generally applicable, that applies to any country, any armed forces or armed groups that receive US funding or US weapons. It essentially says that if you commit gross violations of human rights, either torture or unlawful killing, sort of a range of kind of the core international criminal law violations that come out of international humanitarian law and wars of armed conflict, or rules of armed conflict, you will not get funding to that specific unit, to that specific individual. That's essentially what the Leahy Law does. It's rarely, or if ever, been enforced against a specific unit of the Israeli military or armed forces. So it's, right, we talk about enforcement and sort of connection between this bill and existing law. We're trying to reaffirm the protections and prohibitions and sort of conditionality that would already exist in existing law, knowing that there's complete impunity, and the US government sort of gives a free pass to Israel when it comes to implementation. And we're really trying to hone in on that, on the transparency piece, on the specific violations, and not let those two sit side by side. And we think if we can increase the transparency, increase the awareness around violations, around US complicity, US weapons, etc., right, that'll tip the balance slightly, increase political will, where we sort of shift the balance on the funding paradigm and actually get conditions on Israeli funding, rather than this impunity and unconditional, like you can't touch that approach that's been the norm for the US for decades.
Thanks, Brad. Shana, I think we could probably move on from questions for now if you want to wrap us up.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I see that there are a lot of questions that came in the chat that might be about more specific representatives and their positions, and maybe the feedback or the excuses that they're already giving about their reluctance to get on the bill. So I really want to reinforce and strongly encourage you to attend the drop-in hour that we're planning for 2 weeks from now, because I think we'll be able to really address those issues in a much better fashion and be able to really tailor and target towards those particular reps and the issues surrounding them, rather than in a more general way, that we've been kind of talking about the bill and general strategies for addressing it. We're planning to have our next official No Way to Treat a Child webinar on May 18th at 8 p.m. And we'll have hopefully some exciting updates around the bill, and we'll most likely be talking more about child detention in that webinar. So stay tuned to your email. I know Miranda will quickly get out an email in the next day or so with follow-up from this webinar, and all of the links and resources that we've shared and discussed. Please, if you're a member of an organization that's interested in endorsing the bill, remember to log on and fill out the Google form. And yes, Brad, I see you put in the chat that people should email us if they have specific questions on specific members too. So if you have more urgent questions, always feel free to reach out to us at info@nowaytotreatachild.org. With that, I want to thank all of you folks for spending the last 70 minutes or so with us, and we look forward to continuing to organize and work with you. We would not have reached this momentous occasion with our fourth bill and our broadest bill in Congress without the hard work of grassroots supporters like you and the people who are engaging every day to make sure that their representatives and elected officials know what's happening in Palestine. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see some of you hopefully in a couple of weeks, and the rest of you in mid-May. Have a great night.
All right, everyone. Thanks.